Picture this. A man screaming as his flesh literally melts away in boiling water. This isn't fiction. This actually happened in London, and the reason why will shock you. If you're curious about the darkest corners of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the past. The morning of April 5th, 1531 arrived with an ominous gray sky hanging over London, as if the heavens themselves could sense the unspeakable horror that was about to unfold. At Smithfield, the usual gathering place for executions and livestock markets, a crowd began forming early. But today wasn't ordinary. Something far more sinister awaited them. In the center of the square sat a massive bronze cauldron, positioned carefully above a crackling fire. The flames danced beneath it as the water inside began to heat, sending wisps of steam into the cold morning air. A nervous energy rippled through the growing crowd when the guards appeared, dragging forth a man whose hands were bound tightly behind his back. This was Richard Rose, a cook who had served in the household of Bishop John Fisher. His face had turned an ashen white, drained of all color as his eyes fixed on the instrument that would deliver his death. Terror consumed his features as he contemplated what lay ahead, an execution so rare and brutal that few had ever witnessed such a thing. Within moments he would experience something no human should ever endure, being boiled alive, feeling every inch of his skin slowly dissolving in scalding water. But how does a simple kitchen servant end up facing such an unimaginably cruel fate? To understand this macabre tale, we need to travel back several weeks and uncover the twisted events that led to this moment. February 1531 found England in the grip of one of its most chaotic periods. King Henry VIII had become obsessed with annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon so he could wed Anne Boleyn instead. This royal desire had torn the kingdom into two opposing camps. On one side stood the ambitious courtiers who eagerly supported whatever the king wanted. On the other side were the conservative religious leaders who believed marriage was sacred and could never be dissolved. Among these steadfast opponents stood John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, who had become one of the most vocal critics of the royal divorce. Fisher was a man driven by deep religious conviction, and his unwavering stance had earned him not just the hatred of Henry VIII, but also the vengeful enmity of the Boleyn family, who saw him as the primary obstacle blocking their path to power and prestige. The bishop lived in constant fear for his life. Every night he would sleep in a different room within his residence, never staying in the same chamber twice. He took extraordinary precautions with everything he ate and drank, terrified that someone might attempt to poison him. As we'll discover, this paranoia wasn't the product of an overactive imagination. It was completely justified. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying this incredible true story, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. At the episcopal residence in Lambeth, located south of London's bustling center, Bishop Fisher maintained a full staff of servants to keep his household running smoothly. Among them worked Richard Rose, the cook responsible for preparing the bishop's meals. Rose appeared completely unremarkable in every way, a middle-aged man with no distinguishing features that would set him apart from the countless other servants who labored in England's great houses. He was discreet, efficient, and had never given anyone the slightest reason for suspicion. That is, until the fateful afternoon of February 18th arrived. On that particular afternoon, Bishop Fisher had invited several guests to dine at his residence. The menu included a thick, hearty soup that was common fare in English households of that era. Rose went about preparing the broth exactly as he always did, following the same recipes and methods he'd used countless times before. But this time he secretly added a mysterious powder to the food. Later, when questioned under torture, Rose would insist that he had done this merely as a jest. He claimed he believed the substance was nothing more than a simple purgative, something that would cause uncomfortable intestinal distress, but nothing lethal. According to his version of events, he thought he was playing a cruel prank, not attempting murder. When the meal was served, Bishop Fisher ate only small portions of the soup. This wasn't due to any suspicion on his part, but perhaps simply because he lacked appetite that day. The other guests, however, consumed much larger helpings of the poisoned broth, savoring what they believed to be a perfectly ordinary meal. Following the custom of the time, any leftover food was distributed to the beggars who had gathered outside seeking alms. Among these desperate souls were Bennett Kirwan and Alice Triet, two humble people who could hardly believe their incredible luck at receiving hot, freshly prepared food from a bishop's own kitchen. They devoured their portions eagerly, grateful for such unexpected generosity. Hours passed peacefully. Then the horror began. Excruciating abdominal pains struck everyone who had consumed the soup. Violent vomiting seized them, followed by cold sweats that soaked their clothes. Convulsions racked their bodies as the poison coursed through their systems. Bishop Fisher, having ingested only small amounts, managed to survive the ordeal, though he suffered terribly. The other guests fell gravely ill but would eventually recover. Bennett and Alice, however, who had hungrily devoured every drop of their portions, were not so fortunate. The next morning brought a grisly discovery. The bodies of Bennett Kirwan and Alice Triet were found contorted in unimaginable agony, their faces frozen in expressions of pure torment. The poison had done its deadly work, claiming two innocent lives whose only crime had been accepting what they thought was charitable food. News of the poisoning spread through London like wildfire. When King Henry VIII learned of the incident, his fury was absolutely explosive. Although Fisher remained his political enemy, an attack of this nature threatened something far more important than personal rivalries. It threatened the very foundation of royal authority. If bishops could be poisoned in their own homes, what would guarantee the safety of the king himself? The monarch immediately ordered a thorough investigation. Richard Roos was quickly apprehended while desperately trying to flee London, probably hoping to disappear into the countryside before anyone could connect him to the crime. Instead, he found himself dragged to the Tower of London, that fortress of terror where England's most dangerous prisoners met their fate. Inside the tower's dungeons, Roos was subjected to the rack, a horrifying torture device that would stretch a prisoner's limbs almost to the breaking point. Tied to this X-shaped contraption, he endured excruciating pain as his joints were slowly pulled apart. Under this unbearable agony, Roos finally confessed to adding the powder to the soup, but he maintained his story that he had been unaware of its lethal properties. He insisted he thought it was merely a purgative, intended to cause temporary discomfort, nothing more. Surprisingly, the case didn't follow the normal legal procedures that would typically govern such a crime. On February 28th, King Henry VIII took the extraordinary step of personally appearing before Parliament to report the poisoning, something virtually unheard of for the era. The king described the poisoning not just as an attack against Bishop Fisher, but as an act of high treason against the crown itself. Parliament, always eager to please their unpredictable and temperamental monarch, quickly approved what became known as the Act for Poisoning, 22nd Henry VIII, Chapter 9. This new law classified poisoning as high treason and established a specific, horrifying punishment for such crimes: death by boiling. This development deserves our closest attention because it reveals something truly disturbing about royal power. Henry VIII didn't just determine Roos's guilt without providing him a proper trial. He actually created a new law retroactively to punish him in the most exemplary fashion possible. The existing penalty for treason was already absolutely terrible. The condemned would be dragged through the streets by horses, hanged until nearly dead, then castrated and quartered while still alive. But the king wanted something even worse, something that would perfectly match what he saw as the horror of poisoning, a slow death in which the criminal would experience progressive heat, feeling his body literally cook by degrees. But why such extraordinary cruelty? Why did the king involve himself personally in a case that, while serious, involved only a cook and a bishop who wasn't even his political ally? The true motives were never fully clarified, but historians have proposed several theories. Some suggest that Henry VIII harbored a genuine, deep-seated phobia of poisoning, considering it the most cowardly method of death, unworthy even for his enemies. Others, taking a more skeptical view, see complex political motivations at work behind the scenes. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, who was both a confidant of Bishop Fisher and a staunch defender of Queen Catherine, suggested in his private correspondence that the king acted with such extreme violence to divert suspicions away from himself, as he is too noble to resort to such means, or at least away from Anne Boleyn and her ambitious father. This theory isn't without solid foundation. Rumors began circulating almost immediately after the poisoning, with many people whispering accusations that the Boleyn family had secretly hired Rose to eliminate Fisher, who represented one of the greatest obstacles to Henry's marriage plans. A swift and spectacularly brutal execution could serve to end any deeper investigation that might potentially implicate figures close to the king. Whatever the real truth behind these events, Richard Roos's fate had been sealed. His execution was scheduled for April 5th, and such an unusual spectacle drew massive crowds to Smithfield. People pushed and shoved to secure the best viewing positions, as if this were some kind of theatrical performance rather than the horrific end of a human being. Street vendors circulated through the crowd, hawking food and drinks to the eager spectators. The great bronze cauldron was already bubbling violently when Rose was brought forth by the guards. Some historical accounts suggest he had been given alcohol beforehand, perhaps a final act of mercy for a man who would receive no other form of compassion. The guards stripped him of his clothing and positioned themselves to lift him above the cauldron. A priest quickly recited a prayer, offering absolution for the condemned man's sins, though there would be no relief for his physical body. Then began what would go down as one of the most horrifying executions ever recorded in English history. 3 times Richard Roos was immersed in the boiling water, each dip more terrible than the last. On the first immersion, only his legs were submerged in the scalding liquid. His screams echoed across the entire square, as the skin of his lower limbs separated from the flesh beneath. Some people in the crowd immediately fainted at the sight. Others turned away, unable to bear witnessing such agony. On the second dip, his torso was submerged up to his chest. The water, which had been clear moments before, acquired a pinkish hue as it literally dissolved his flesh. Rose's screams were no longer recognizably human. They had transformed into indistinct gurgles as he desperately struggled for air, his voice destroyed by the steam and agony. On the third and final immersion, Richard Roos was completely submerged in the boiling water. Death, though horrible beyond imagination, finally freed him from his torment and ended his suffering. Rose's execution wasn't an isolated incident created just for him. Thanks to the new law Henry had pushed through Parliament, others convicted of poisoning would face exactly the same fate. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy was boiled alive at this very same spot in Smithfield, accused of poisoning 3 different households where she had worked as a servant. This barbaric method of execution was only officially abolished during the reign of Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, as part of broader reforms aimed at limiting the most savage punishments that had characterized his father's rule. What makes Richard Roos's case particularly disturbing isn't just the brutal nature of his punishment. It's the political circumstances that surrounded the entire affair. He became a victim of one of the most volatile moments in English history, when the kingdom stood balanced on the threshold of monumental religious and political changes that would reshape the nation forever. John Fisher, the man Rose had allegedly attempted to kill, wouldn't escape his own tragic fate. 4 years after the poisoning incident in 1535, Fisher was executed for refusing to recognize Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England. His severed head was displayed on London Bridge until it became completely unrecognizable, then replaced by that of Thomas More, another opponent who suffered exactly the same fate. If you're fascinated by these dark historical tales, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Anne Boleyn, whose rise to the throne was indirectly connected to the Rose case, wouldn't enjoy a happy ending either. In 1536, just 5 years after these events we've been following, she herself would be executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations that are now widely considered complete fabrications designed to allow Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. As for Henry VIII himself, He would continue his turbulent and bloody reign for another 16 years, marrying 4 more women, breaking definitively with Rome, and transforming England into a Protestant country. His paranoia and brutality would only increase with age, leaving behind a trail of blood that would forever stain English history. Today, the site where Richard Roos met his terrible end has become a busy commercial center. There's no plaque or monument to remember the horrors that were committed there centuries ago. Few Londoners passing daily through modern Smithfield have any idea that beneath their hurried feet, a man was once slowly boiled alive in a bronze cauldron. The story of Richard Roos offers us a deeply disturbing glimpse into our past. It reminds us of a time when justice and cruelty walked hand in hand, when the powerful could literally rewrite laws to satisfy their personal whims, and when the value of human life was determined entirely by the political usefulness of someone's death. It remains impossible to determine today whether Roos was truly guilty of intentional murder, whether he served as a convenient scapegoat to cover up a larger conspiracy, or whether he simply made a tragic mistake by adding unknown substances to his master's food without understanding their deadly nature. What we know with absolute certainty is that his punishment exceeded any reasonable sense of justice, even by the brutal standards of his own time. Execution by boiling, a death that literally recreates the very act of cooking, carried a macabre irony that cannot be ignored when we consider Roos's profession. The man whose entire life had been dedicated to preparing food in cauldrons ended his own days as an ingredient in one. It represents a punishment that suggests not just the elimination of the criminal, but a terrible form of poetic vengeance designed to satisfy the sense of retributive justice that characterized that more brutal era. 5 centuries have passed since that gray April afternoon in Smithfield. The world has changed in ways that Henry VIII and his contemporaries could hardly have imagined. Our justice systems, though certainly imperfect, now seek rehabilitation more than pure retribution. Our laws are supposedly applied equally to both the powerful and the common citizen. Our punishments, even for the most heinous crimes, don't include deliberate torture designed to maximize suffering. Nevertheless, the story of Richard Roos, the man who was boiled alive, continues to fascinate us precisely because it shows us how thin the line really is that separates civilization from barbarism. It demonstrates how institutions that should exist to protect citizens can easily transform into instruments of terror when they're manipulated by those who hold power. Under the hurried feet of modern Londoners rushing about their daily business, the echoes of the past still resonate through the stones of Smithfield. And if we listen carefully enough, perhaps we can still hear the screams of a cook who, on a gray April day in 1531, discovered in the most terrible way imaginable what it truly means to find yourself on the other side of the cauldron. Thanks for watching this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If stories like this intrigue you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible true tales that reveal the shocking realities of our past. And don't forget to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all around the world.